A lot of the complaints I get from other GMs regarding overpowered characters come from people that don't necessarily understand the rules. And case in point, the wizard. Wizards have always been amazingly powerful. And I do mean always, from the very beginning. But why? Magic! The game has always suffered from a problem known as linear fighters, quadratic wizards, meaning that fighters don't necessarily get much better over time as the wizard does. However, the wizard has a fatal flaw, that being their spellbook. Now, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons defines a spellbook, and you can find information on that on page 25 of your Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook. However, it doesn't really go into detail about it, and it says that it talks more about it in the spells section. It does not. For information in Pathfinder, it's on page 79 of your core rulebook, and in 5th edition, page 114 of your Player's Handbook. Why does the wizard have the weakness of the spellbook, and why is it a weakness? Wizards do not know every spell on the wizard spell list. In fact, they know relatively few, especially at the start of the game. This is in contrast to, say, clerics or druids who have access to all of the spells on their list. At least in Pathfinder. I'm not entirely sure how it works in 5th edition, as I don't play it much anymore. But in both games, you have a limited pool of spells to choose from. And there are a few ways to learn new spells. The most obvious of which is to level up, at which point you gain X number of new spells, depending on what edition you're playing. In Pathfinder, it's 2. However, there are other ways to learn new spells. If you have a scroll, or a captured enemy spellbook, or a spellbook that you borrowed from a friend, you can pay material cost in gold pieces, depending on the level of the spell involved, to transfer it over to your spellbook, and there's a chance of failure. Why do we pay gold? Because the reason wizards have a limited number of spells they can cast per day is because without that limit, and if they had access to everything, wizards would be unstoppable. And now the spellbook. Without their spellbook, a wizard is nothing. He still has magical potential, of course. He can still activate a wand or a scroll, and he can possibly create these items. But he doesn't know his spells. Because each morning a wizard must spend an hour reading from their spellbook to prepare their spells. Every edition, pretty much. Again, majorly different. But in Pathfinder, in 5th edition, there is a heavy emphasis placed on the spellbook in a really big section in both of them. And GMs ignore this. Players ignore it. They ignore capturing enemy spellbooks, like going out of their way to capture them, going out of their way to learn a new spell somewhere. Because you don't think about it. Because players don't pay attention to the restrictions imposed on the spellbook. Like, for instance, in Pathfinder, a spellbook has 100 pages, and each spell you learn takes up a number of pages equal to its spell level. So, why? Honestly, because it's more work. That's the only reason. People don't like math. They take it away. They don't bother with carrying capacity. They don't bother with encumbrance. They don't bother with food or drink. So why would they bother with a wizard's spellbook? Because it's important. People complain about overpowered characters. On Reddit all the time, I see threads, and in person, I hear conversations about GMs who say, well, how can I tempt my paladin? How can I cause my paladin player to fall from the grace of his god? Wouldn't that be a fun little story? You know what else would be a fun little story? The wizard losing their spellbook. A thief stole it. They lost it. And this is honestly awful. It screws over everyone. But if you read the spell descriptions on a lot of evocations, like Burning Hands or Fireball, everything flammable in that area catches on fire. Everything flammable, including a spellbook. So why am I bringing this up? Capture the spellbook. Encourage your players to be smart about it. There are spells like Secluded Grimoire to send your spellbook somewhere else. Back in the day, in the older editions, spellcasters, magic users, as they were known, would keep different spellbooks for different occasions. They would have copies. They would leave them in safe places. And it actually goes out of its way to encourage you to do so in the 5th edition Player's Handbook, which is a good thing. Your wizard should be protective of that thing. Your wizard should go out of his way to make sure it's protected, and he should have a copy somewhere. In Pathfinder, there's a feat called Spell Mastery, and it lets you prepare 2 spells every day without having to consult your spellbook. That's a damn good spell. Or a damn good feat, rather. Why? Well, what happens if your party gets captured or they wake up in a dungeon? You know who doesn't complain? The fighter, who now doesn't have his weapons on him. You know who does complain? The wizard. Because he doesn't have his spellbook on him. Except it doesn't matter, because most of the games I've seen, they're still able to cast their spells anyway somehow. It's ridiculous. Like, imagine the fighter fails his strength check. You're all stuck in chains now. What are you going to do? Oh, the wizard took spell mastery and he has a way out of this. Or the wizard's familiar can go and bring him his spellbook and he can save the day. Really, it's not too bad. There's a sort of importance of paranoia that they place on the spellbook in Pathfinder, and oddly enough, even more so in 5th edition. They place a huge importance on it. One final thought here before I head out is the idea that you shouldn't use this as a punishment against your players. You should never, ever just be, okay, you wake up and your spellbook's gone. Never do that, especially out of the blue. Build up towards that. Like, make sure that your player knows that losing his spellbook is an option in this world. Just so many people play without the spellbook rules that It's kind of ridiculous if you just spring it on them out of nowhere. And with 10 minutes having passed, my pointless ramble is over. Have a fantastic day, and happy gaming.